blossoms. My mother's eyes were sad and inward-looking, heavy with the things she'd seen, things I didn't know about but could see reflected there in those two blue mirrors. It was an oppressively hot afternoon in July 1948 when I sat on the steps of our Selby Avenue house, trying to find some consolation in those blossoms that, being morning flowers, were beginning now to droop and close in the heat. I told myself I wanted to be there, enjoying all that I had waited for through the long Minnesota winter, and that my Aunt Dartha had so carefully tended and coaxed into bloom. But it wasn't true. I didn't want to be there. I wanted to be with my brother Dewey, and he and his friends had gone off without me. Plenty of brothers and sisters don't get along, but Dewey was my best friend. There was no one in the world I wanted to be with more than Dewey. And in spite of the fact that I was a girl 4 years younger than he, Dewey liked me, too. He even told me sometimes I was a pretty good kid sister. Of course, I had other friends, my favorite one being Rosemary Knudsen, who lived not far from us over on Portland. But every year her family spent the summer months at their lake cabin, and I never saw her from the time school let out until it started up again in the fall. There were other girls in the neighborhood to play with when Rosemary was gone, and we sought each other out from time to time for hopscotch or hide-and-seek, or to hold imaginary tea parties on the lawn. But mostly I tried to shadow my brother and his two best friends, Andy Johansen and Jerry Butterfield. I wouldn't have described myself as a tomboy, but I rather enjoyed taking part in their boyish escapades. Give me a stick gun, and I could play cowboys and Indians with the best of them. I wasn't afraid of climbing trees, threading worms onto fishing hooks, catching tadpoles with my bare hands. I thought nothing of swimming in one of the lakes with my clothes on, or running barefoot through the sprinklers in the rich people's yards over on Summit Avenue. One of our favorite ways to pass an afternoon was to traipse down to the city dump and scour for treasures hidden in the piles of St. Paul's refuse. It was there Dewey found a lot of the scraps he used for building telescopes. I liked to collect odds and ends for myself, however dirty or broken. Tin boxes, picture frames, empty fountain pens, the occasional piece of costume jewelry. Andy and Jerry hauled away anything that looked like it might belong on a go-kart, or that might make a good addition to the fort in Andy's yard. We also rescued old automobile tires that we rolled back to our neighborhood and played with in the streets. After being with the boys, I often came home wet, muddy, smelly, and with odd bits of garbage tangled in my hair. But that didn't stop me. Whatever the guys did, I was right behind them. Dewey and his friends were good sports and didn't complain about my being there, though Andy eventually dubbed me Tag-Along Tierney. The name stuck and was shortened to Tag. The guys each had a nickname, too, so I wore the name they gave me as a badge of acceptance. Dewey's nickname was Galileo, because he was always studying the night sky, making star charts, building telescopes. He claimed that someday man would reach the moon, and that he, Dewey Tierney, would be the very first to set his foot in moon dust. Of course, nobody believed him. Not just the part about his being the first man on the moon, but that any man would get to the moon at all. Grown-ups clicked their tongues and said he was a boy who read too many comic books. The kids in school said he was crazy, even Andy and Jerry. Nobody's ever going to get that far, they said, though you have to understand that to a couple of untraveled kids like Andy Johansen and Jerry Butterfield, even Fargo, North Dakota was pretty much beyond the realm of the reachable. But Dewey always had a comeback for the skeptics, be they kids or grown-ups. Yeah, and they laughed at the Wright brothers, too, and said they'd never fly. That being a statement of fact, few people bothered to argue with Dewey any further. Andy Johansen was nicknamed Houdini, because he was forever having his older brother lock him into the coat closet in the front hall of their house, the purpose being that Andy was to work his way out. So far, he had been completely unsuccessful. His mother was beginning to worry about the hours he spent among the woolen jackets and galoshes in that dark cubicle, picking at the lock with a twisted bobby pin. Andy, however, swore it would all be worth it when he finally became known as the greatest escape artist on Earth. Personally, I thought Dewey had a better chance of walking on the moon than Andy had of ever getting himself out of that closet. Jerry Butterfield we called Michelangelo because he was always doodling in class. He had no desire to become an artist, which was probably a good thing because he had no artistic talent whatsoever. What he wanted to do when he grew up was to drive a streetcar like his dad, and that he could do already. Could do it blindfolded, he boasted. So school was a waste of time. Not a single thing he might learn in those hallowed halls would make him a better streetcar driver, and so he doodled away the time until he could finally just grow up and graduate. Doodling was, after all, far more interesting than calculating square roots or reading about the Boxer Rebellion in China. Anyway, to get back to that particular day in July 1948, Ma had told Dewey and me weeks earlier that we couldn't go swimming any more that summer. Every year someone went swimming, she said, and spent the rest of his life paying for it. She was right, too. There were plenty of ways to get polio during the warm weather months, but swimming was the most reliable. Every summer when Ma heard that the first case of polio had hit the Twin Cities, our days at the watering hole were over. I understood Ma's fears. I was afraid myself. 2 years earlier, the polio epidemic had been so bad that they'd closed all sorts of public places, swimming pools, restaurants, movie theaters. They even shut down the state fair, saying the crowded fairgrounds would be nothing but a breeding ground for the disease that both crippled and killed. A couple of badly aimed sneezes, and the germs would fell a large percentage of Minnesota's population. When people went out, which most did as little as possible, they wore surgical masks so that everyone would keep his germs to himself. I watched from the front window of our house as pedestrians passed by looking scrubbed and ready for the operating room. In spite of precautions, nearly 3,000 people contracted polio in Minnesota alone that summer of 1946, and not a few of them died. Ma was terrified. That was a long, boring summer for Dewey and me, and this one was turning out to be just the same. Our misery that July was compounded by an unbearable heat wave. Since Independence Day, the soaring temperatures in the Twin Cities of St. Paul and Minneapolis had been at the top of the local news. Heat spurs big holiday exodus. Heat wave to hang on, and mercury to go near 100 today. Heat can do far more than leave a person feeling fatigued, irritable, and just plain miserable. It can literally be a killer, and that summer it was. On the 7th of July, a 58-year-old St. Paul man was found sprawled among the tomatoes and cucumbers in his garden, dead at least an hour before his wife discovered him. The newspaper said he'd had a heart attack, the implication being that it was brought on by the heat. Ma said testily that the man's dying was his own fault. He should have known better than to go out and garden in a heat wave. But Aunt Dorothy contended that most everyone was working in their gardens the same as always, and the poor man couldn't have known that pulling a few weeds from his tomato patch would kill him. "Why would you want to blame him?" Aunt Dorothy asked, as though he'd deliberately set out to do himself in. "Doing something like that is courting disaster," Ma said sternly. "What could he expect?" "What could he expect?" Auntie echoed. "How could he have known, the poor fellow? Oh, cry me a river, Dorothy. He as good as hung himself." Aunt Dorothy shook her head, obviously perplexed. But I knew Ma. She was afraid, and when she was afraid, she got angry. She longed for reason over randomness when it came to the distribution of human tragedies, and so she decided that most disasters were the result of people's recklessness, and that if you were careful and played by the rules, life would be more inclined to bypass you as it went about handing out its trials. Ma thought she knew what would keep Dewey and me alive through the perilous Minnesota summers, and no doubt she very well did, so she laid down certain rules that would harness us to safety. Rule number 1, no swimming for the rest of the season after the first diagnosis of polio was made in the Twin Cities. Dewey, though, felt certain that his chances of dying of heat stroke were far greater than his chances of contracting polio, especially after the man was found dead in the tomato patch. My brother decided to take matters into his own hands. On that particular day in mid-July, he told me that he and Andy and Jerry were going to the lake for its, as he said, remedial benefits, and it'd be best if I didn't come along.